Hello, everyone. I'm so pleased to have on board today historian Jack Warren. Jack is the editor-in-chief of The American Crisis, an online journal of history and commentary. He's also the author of The Presidency of George Washington, America's First Veterans, and Freedom, the Enduring Importance of the American Revolution. I'm also pleased to discover that Jack is a neighbor. He lives in Alexandria, Virginia, not more than a few miles where I'm from, in Falls Church. We first networked via LinkedIn, but now it's so good to meet in person here at the Kane Academy headquarters. Welcome to the History 250 podcast.
I'm delighted to be with you and excited to have a conversation.
Well, I am too. I hope you and your family had a good Thanksgiving. Was everybody together here in Northern Virginia, or were you out of town?
Well, for the first time in forever, we were scattered. My daughter lives out on the West Coast. She's a historian, too, teaches at the University of Southern California. And my middle child, Dr. Audrey Warren, is a specialist in structural biology and does research in New York City. Our son was with us, and he's an environmental scientist. And they're obviously I'm very proud of my family, and they're really wonderful. And even got one historian out of the bunch. So
there
was
you
good.
go.
Their mother's a missile scientist, so we've got a lot of ground covered in our household.
Yeah, well, it's always hard to compete, I suppose, in the family when somebody can say, "Well, I'm a rocket scientist."
Yeah, but I can read ancient Greek, so.
Oh, there you go. Deeper, older knowledge, true wisdom. That's great. Well, thanks for being here. The topic today is, of course, right up your alley. It's the American Revolution. Let's start with the language of the event. What did the founders call the revolution?
Oh, that's a good one. No one has ever asked me that. They, of course, within a generation, they referred to it as the revolution. I mean, John Adams, in his correspondence with Thomas Jefferson, late in life, once they had reconciled after years of being at loggerheads with one another, they discussed in their correspondence the meaning of the American Revolution. And of course, Adams famously said that the American Revolution took place long before the war. He was frustrated by people conflating the war and the great political change, the upheaval that had happened. He said that the American Revolution took place in the minds and hearts of Americans well before the war began.
What's the best case for Adams' position? Is it that the war didn't happen apart from a conscious understanding of where American colonists stood vis-a-vis the Crown and the Parliament, and the will to engage the war wouldn't have been there had they had not had those previous experiences leading up to it?
That's I would simplify it. I would say Americans had to reach the place where they would reject monarchical government. And they had reached that point, obviously, by the summer of 1776. To us, that isn't as profoundly as important as it was to them. We live in a world where there are very few true monarchies left. The monarchies that exist are mostly symbolic and constitutional monarchies. And it's hard for modern people to grasp an essential fact about the age of the American Revolution. When the American Revolution began, everyone in the world, this is a strong statement, everyone in the world was governed by a monarch in some way, by a king, a czar, an emperor, and had been since the beginning of human civilization, with very few exceptions. You'd had brief republics that had survived, often not very long, and that was something that worried the revolutionary leadership enormously. They were committed to disposing of monarchy, but what will provide order in its place was the central question. They took a leap of faith in believing in republicanism, the possibility of ordinary people to set aside their selfish interests for the good of the community, and that in that way the good of all could be preserved without overarching monarchical authority. Adams, I think, was right in that sense. The Great Revolution is the willingness of Americans to depart from monarchical authority. And that takes place by 1776. At least by then you have a critical mass that's prepared to do it. But I think Adams is wrong. Here's the other argument. I think Adams is wrong in the sense that he doesn't appreciate how revolutionary the war is for American society. The American Revolutionary War, up until the interminable Asian wars of modern times, is the longest war we ever fought. It went on for 8 years, from 1775 to 1783. It didn't end at Yorktown in 1781. It touched every part of the country, almost every family, every community in some way or another. It injured, wounded, killed. People died of illness in greater proportion than any American war except our Civil War, which in a way is unfair because both sides count in the Civil War, right? And I'm not counting the British when I talk about loss of life, injury, death, sickness, and so forth in the American Revolutionary War. Lincoln captured this brilliantly in a speech he gave once. He said, in every household in America at the time of the Revolution, there was some family member who had lost a limb, who had lost a life, the scars of the Revolution were visible on the faces of the American people for a generation after the Revolutionary War. I mean, he understood that, and he recognized that all of our subsequent history would be bound up in the idealism and the principles of the American Revolution. It's what makes the Gettysburg Address such a brilliant speech. In a very tight, tiny address, he explains that 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth upon this continent a new nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. It's a brilliant synopsis of the importance of the Revolution, particularly if you understand what he meant when he said our fathers. I think most would probably think our fathers means somebody we call today often the founding fathers, right? Jefferson, Madison, Washington, Patrick Henry, Alexander Hamilton, Benjamin Franklin. That's not who Lincoln was talking about. When he said our fathers, he's alluding to the ordinary soldiers of the Revolution, the literal fathers and grandfathers of the people to whom he was talking.
So something akin to our ancestors.
Right,
yeah.
All of us. And that's actually, for me, that is a central idea. The Revolution was a vast popular movement. It was not dominated by a handful of leaders. We think about the Revolution, we tend to focus way too much on, I think, on those brilliant leaders. And they were extraordinary people, Jefferson, Washington, Franklin, Henry, and so forth. But a leader without followers is just a guy out taking a walk. They embodied the aspirations, the idealism, the hopes of ordinary Americans. And it was because they embodied it that they were able to lead a vast popular movement in favor of liberty, which was a new ideal. As they framed it, it's the most extraordinary event, I think, in modern history for me. For the last 500 years, the American Revolution doesn't begin intentionally that way, but becomes that. And so I think, to circle back to where we began, Adams is certainly right that the rejection of monarchical culture is at the heart of the American Revolution. That did take place before the war. But the war draws in everyone in British America, in what becomes the United States, and touches their lives. It becomes part of the fabric of our national identity. Part of that is because it lasted so long. You think of countries that have quick revolutions, little coups, and they don't get traditions out of that. They don't get heroes. Traditions often of suffering and sadness, it's true, but those national traditions come out of our revolution, and they help create the fabric of American national identity.
I love this set of answers that you've given. I want to ask if you could go a couple steps further with the term revolution. That's a heady term. And we think about the French Revolution, the Bolshevik Revolution, the revolution in China. These are all revolutions of monumental impact. But we think of them, I think we think of them rightly, as distinct from the American Revolution. We think of the American Revolution closer to the Glorious Revolution in England. We think of the more radical revolutions as kind of opposed to some of the things that the American Revolution stood for. At the same time, Bernard Bailyn has one of the seminal books on the era, the ideological origins of the American Revolution. And Other people would say ideology is actually proper to the radical side of things. So can you help us distinguish between the uses of the term revolution? And finally, we come to the 1960s, that whole era, and we're all still reeling from the impact of the sexual revolution. So we look at revolution sometimes as highly destructive. You talked about the Americans rejecting monarchical government, but is that the same kind of rejection as we see in France, Russia, China, Cuba, and elsewhere?
The American Revolution is a modern revolution. I think it's the first of the great or important modern revolutions. And in this sense, I think it is quite distinct from the English Civil War, the English Rebellion of the 1640s, and then the Glorious Revolution of the 1680s. I know that the American revolutionaries often referred back to those events, part of the English legal and constitutional tradition, of which they were a part. But the American Revolution was a fundamental assault on the traditional source of governing authority, of monarchy. Americans had lived a long way from the direct influence of British government in day-to-day affairs for a very long time. And they were used to a degree of autonomy that was unusual, if not unique, in the European imperial world. And so they were, at the beginning of the American revolutionary conflagration, and beginning as resistance to imperial regulation and taxation in the 1760s. And at that point, it looks an awful lot like a lot of quarrels in the old regime, by which I mean sort of a quarrel about, I'll use the word chartered liberties. There were cities in England which were exempt from certain taxes, which were imposed on other places, without any notion of equality, right? The port cities have to pay a certain tax to build ships, and that was expected of ports. The idea of universal equality, even in how tax burdens are distributed, is completely alien to the old world, to the old regime, which is built up on all kinds of privileges and immunities that individuals and communities enjoy. And in many ways, the revolutionary agitation, the resistance to Britain begins this way. But the British drove the American, particularly the intellectuals in America, with their response. They said, look, you don't have you're not in a position to dispute what the Crown and Parliament want to do. You don't have, you will be governed as we say. And of course, there were British pamphleteers and ministerial hirelings who argued, when Americans, the people who became the American colonists, left Britain, they lost all of their privileges as Britons. They ceased to be Britons. They became simply a colonial people to be governed as we wished. And of course, many people, famous people, Samuel Johnson, for example, who sort of said, when you all went there, you became barbarians. It's really what you are, barely better than the Indians, and you're certainly in no position to tell us what your rights are. We will decide what your rights are. And that response, which becomes clear by 1770, 72, really drives Americans in a radical direction, partly because they can't counter it very effectively. In fact, Parliament, or the king in Parliament, is sovereign, and the people aren't sovereign.
What's the line of demarcation when you say radical? When they finally turn radical, the evidence lies where?
Well, it's the rejection of royal authority. People lose confidence in governing institutions. They no longer believe that those governing institutions are acting in the public interest in any way. And it was an article of faith, and it really was in many monarchies an article of faith, that the king would act in the interests of ordinary subjects, not citizens, subjects. And the Americans clung to this. The American resistance clung to this through the 1760s. The idea, well, there were the king's ministers, but he was being ill-served. King is young and inexperienced. but he has the interests of everyone in his realm at heart. He will hear our cries. And this is an ancient idea. You can follow that into antiquity. The patriot king will hear our cries. You can see it among the Greeks and the Romans, the idea of the established monarchs will have the best interest of their people at heart. The Americans conclude, and it is the moment of radicalization. In different places at different times, it's between 1770 and 1774, 75, maybe mostly right on the eve of armed conflict, 73, 74, that the crown that the established authorities no longer represent the interests of ordinary subjects. They cannot be relied upon. And that at the distance that Americans are from Britain, unrepresented in Parliament, they have no means of redress. And so they decide that they will seek to reassert, really, their autonomy, their independence within the empire at first. And that's when the Revolutionary War begins. It doesn't begin as a war to break away from the empire. At first, Americans are simply seeking autonomy within the empire, which they had long enjoyed. The war had been going on for more than a year before Americans declared their independence. There's no hiding the fact that that is a radical moment in Western history. It's as radical as anything that happened in France or Russia or China. It's bigger in many ways than those things. The rejection of monarchical authority goes back to what I was saying before. We don't get our hands around the fact that the world was governed by monarchs. And here, these upstart colonies say, no, we will no longer be governed by a monarch. And to support that, they assert the universal rights of mankind. Now, they can do that and create a new polity effectively. The French are unable to do that. The Ancien regime is too stratified and too entrenched in France for a revolution in favor of universal liberty to work in France without enormous social upheaval and violence.
Well, the French revolutionaries also, they claimed something more radical than the American revolutionaries, certainly at the religious level, to supplant Christianity with the cult of supreme being. Didn't they also go farther than the Americans in terms of claiming kind of a much more substantial level of state control? And so the whole idea that the general will make you free, I mean, the levels of coercion in the French Revolution certainly surpass what happened in anything that we saw in the American Revolution.
And this is absolutely true. It almost has to be, I say, because of the entrenched layers of power in the Ancien regime, they have to overturn the established, in order to create a new regime in which there is any degree of popular political freedom, they believe that they have to overturn the established Catholic Church. America doesn't have an established church nationally. The church was fragmented here in a way that created a kind of, salutary religious freedom even before the basic principles of religious freedom were worked out here. Now, that isn't to say there wasn't a great deal of religious oppression in colonial America. There was, but so the French revolutionaries have to attack the church, which of course is a defender of the old regime and the aristocracy. America has no old regime to overthrow, not really. Not anywhere near as wealthy and powerful or entrenched as Europe. For France to have a revolution, it doesn't seem possible that the moderate, say, constitutional monarchy model that, say, Lafayette might have had France follow was possible, and it certainly didn't work out that way. And so the revolution, which begins with a degree of moderation in France, degenerates into an assault on all of the ideas of the old society that it was attacking. And the French Revolution destroys its seed corn. It digs up the orchard by the roots. It does all of those metaphors that Burke uses so brilliantly. And I think it's why Burke's Reflections on Revolution in France is one of the great books of the 18th century, maybe the greatest book of the 18th century. 18th century, written so early in the French Revolution. But he can see where this is going, that the overturning of traditional ideas, traditional values, the abolition of Christianity, essentially. He foresees all of these things happening. Americans were spared that because we didn't have an ancien regime to overthrow. And the same thing is true in different ways, different circumstances for Russia and China. The degree of oppression and intolerance in their societies was so vast. They were so sclerotic and so oppressive that they had to be overthrown entire. The tragedy is the kind of tragedy that Orwell predicts in any revolutionary circumstance like that they will end up by being more oppressive. The masters will be Mao, they'll be Robespierre, they'll be Lenin, they'll be Stalin. And America was spared that because the ideas of the American Revolution were liberal in addition to being Republican. That is, they favored individual liberty. They were based on the then still quite new intellectual principle of universal equality. The 18th century thinkers, particularly the American Revolution, were able to integrate both liberal and Republican ideas. Maybe they were in tension in places, but in a way that others were not.
Forrest McDonald says that the founders read more history than they did political theory, which is not to say that Locke wasn't an important player or Montesquieu wasn't an important player. Their grasp of Roman republicanism was deep, and it was formative. Their idea of what a statesman is, their idea of individual character and virtue, very, very powerful.
Oh, absolutely. There are all kinds of streams, and you have this extraordinary. It's extraordinary because they are provincial intellectuals, isolated from, the dialogues of London and Paris and Edinburgh. They're consumers. There aren't very many. The American revolutionaries, and I know that I have, friends who are Jefferson and Madison and Hamilton scholars. They will immediately pound the desk if they hear me saying this. They are largely derivative thinkers. They are practical political scientists before political science exists, trying to find effective ways to translate the ideas of the finest intellectuals of their century into a practical polity. I think it's enough praise to say they succeeded in doing that, in translating those ideas, in translating the ideas of Locke and Montesquieu and the ancients. And MacDonald is right in that the leading founders, particularly Dickinson, Mason, they were great students of ancient history, Roman history in particular. It's extraordinary the degree to which they were not good students of modern history. That is, there wasn't, what they could read about 16th, 17th century Britain. For example, they didn't really know. Hume's History of England, which of course came out in their generation, was an awakening to many of them. That you could have a history of England that, as a nation state, that came up to the present, and they learned about things that had happened in, say, the 17th century, about which their understanding was only vague. And so they were students of history, but they looked,
but chiefly classical
history, and they looked on history not so much as we do, as a study of the process of change, as they looked to the past for models of leadership, of behavior, of effective governance, of character. And they ransacked, particularly antiquity, Roman history, and particularly for the great examples of character. Washington is enormously proud to be regarded as a modern Cincinnatus.
Yes. And,
most moderns don't know who Cincinnatus is, but, anybody who had even a modest education in the last quarter of the 18th century was well acquainted with Cincinnatus, the military hero of the Roman Republic, who saved the Republic, leading its armies, and then returned to his farm, refusing all honors and future office, saying that he had done his duty for the Republic. I mean, Washington wanted to be known this way. And so when Washington took command of the Continental Army in 1775, he agreed to accept that command on the condition that he not be given any salary, that he would not be paid in any way. And then when the war was ended, he went to Annapolis where Congress was meeting and returned his commission. And I've handled thousands of historical documents written by all of the great men of American history. The one that stirred me because it startled me, I gave a talk for members of Congress about 10 years ago, and the Librarian of Congress was our host, and he said, "I thought you would like to see this," and he handed me Washington's commission, the commission that Washington had been given in June of 1775 when he took command of the Continental Army. And I realized holding it, and just holding it was a privilege, that this was Washington had given back to Congress in 1783. In December of 1783, when he went to Annapolis to resign his commission, he gave them back the physical commission. And he said, "I have done the thing that you asked of me, and now I am going home." He was reenacting the ancient drama of Cincinnatus, and he was doing it for educated men and women who understood what that meant. It was the model of classical virtue, of sacrificing your own interests for the good of the whole. And Washington believed wholeheartedly that the nation could only survive if its citizens were virtuous in that way.
Now, the symbolism may be obvious to all of us, but what in antiquity would it have meant to not return a commission?
Well, it would meant that you accept it. You once held power, you wouldn't give it back. You would become, as Cincinnatus had every opportunity to become, the dictator of the empire. And Washington, couldn't he have become a king? Actually, Americans had rejected monarchy. There was no hope of Washington becoming a king. He wouldn't have accepted such a thing, and very few people would have even proposed it. Americans had wholeheartedly rejected monarchy. That doesn't mean that they had rejected the idea of somebody who would become the leader of the republic for life. And I'm often asked, what was Washington's greatest achievement? And the simple fact is, number one, Washington won. He won the war, and it was a hard war to win. And it's hard to imagine anybody else in that generation leading the Continental Army to victory in that war. But after that was certainly Washington's unselfishness, Washington's commitment to the good of the whole, his willingness to give up the enormous power that had been placed in his hands and go home. I mean, George III is credibly said to have responded when he was told, well, the man talking to him, I think Washington is going to resign his commission and go home. And George said, if he does that, he will be the greatest man in the world. And he did it, and he was the greatest man in the world. One of the extraordinary opportunities I had in my career, I edited Washington's papers for many years, and Washington was continuously receiving letters from all over the world, and even as into his presidency, from people who, in one way or another, articulated the idea that he was, in that generation, unique among leaders, that he did not grasp after power. Washington didn't want to become the president of the United States, contemplated resigning after 1 year and turning the office over to John Adams, decided that would be politically unwise. He didn't want to run for re-election after one term, refused to be considered for election for a third term, even though Washington could easily have been re-elected president for life. And our history would be different, I think, if Washington had served 3, 4, 5 terms. He died in 1799, but the accident of his death essentially might not have occurred. He might have lived on into the early 19th century. He died quite suddenly of an unexpected illness. But But our country's history would be profoundly different. Washington said no. He said, you have to learn to get along without me. For a republic to survive, it needs to be able to cultivate new leaders. And more importantly, its people have to be committed to this national experiment in Republican governance. They have to have the virtue. You cannot rely eternally on the virtue of some one man. And it's the difference between our revolution, to circle back to where your question began. It's a great difference between our revolution and the other modern revolutions in that we had leaders willing to surrender power. Whatever virtues they had, and I'm not a very good advocate for believing they had very many at all, the Robespierres, the Lenins, the Stalins, the Maos. The thing they held in common is they held tightly onto power until the moment of their death. They believed that they were the revolution, that they embodied it, and that without them the revolution could not prevail, it could not survive, it could not endure. They created a cult of personality. Washington certainly was the object of a cult of personality, but he refused to play that game. And in doing so, he helped to establish our basic principles of government, that we rely on the virtue of the people and not the virtue of our leaders.
I'd like to hear you talk more about Washington. Let's start with his role as a strategist, as the commander of the Continental Army. Sometimes people think of Washington and kind of reduce his time in the Revolutionary War to the dire straits that he met. We think of the difficulties of Valley Forge. Can you give us a good, accurate picture of Washington the general? How he held the army together, how he met those dire straits, where he strategized in ways that we ought to take notes. I'd like to know more about Washington the general.
He had never commanded, before the American Revolutionary War, he'd never commanded a unit larger than a provincial regiment. He was not, by training or even in many ways by disposition, suited to the command of an 18th century army. But he had spent his adult life very successfully as a planter. He was used to giving orders and seeing those orders obeyed. He was extremely efficient as an administrator of his plantation. He was a good businessman. He was orderly and disciplined in his personal and his private life and his business life. He rose early. He worked hard, got more things done. This is before the Revolution, but through all of his adult life, got more things done before 9 or 10 o'clock in the morning than many people accomplished the whole day. So that for young people in particular, the lesson, you want to be like Washington, get up early, make your bed, and get to work. And he expected the same of people around him who wanted much to imitate him because he was successful in this way. But he had never commanded an army. When he accepted command of the Continental Army, which, by the way, he sought, he wrote Martha a wonderful letter the night that after the Congress met and voted to make him commander of the Continental Army. And he said in that letter to her, he said, I didn't look for this command, this honor, if it is to be called that. He says, and I don't feel myself qualified for it. And it was with nonsense. He had gone to Philadelphia with his militia colonel's uniform, which he had worn on the floor of the Continental Congress every day. No one else was there in uniform. He sat in the back of the room, all 6'2", 6'3" of him, quietly with his arms folded, listening to the conversation, the debate, rarely saying anything, as they discussed creating an army. He wanted to be called upon for this duty. He was volunteering for it. And he told Martha in that same letter, he said, I've kept this command, I'm going to go to Boston. I expect I won't see you until Christmas. I won't be home until Christmas. And
what's the date of that letter again?
That's June of 1775. And he's referring to Christmas of 1775, but and he's prescient only in this. He does make it home by Christmas, but it's Christmas of 1783. the war will last for 8 years, and he will actually only set foot at Mount Vernon once in that 8 years. On his way to Yorktown, he stops in Mount Vernon, make sure everything is tidy so that he can host General Rochambeau and the French staff as they're riding south to Yorktown, and they have dinner at Mount Vernon.
Is that the only time the Washingtons saw each other during
No,
the
no,
war?
she came to his headquarters during the winter, and so she came to be with him and to help run his military household. But, I mean, many generals in that generation would have gone home while the army was in winter quarters. It would not have been regarded as bizarre for him to do that. But he wouldn't do that because Washington was continuously an example to his men. When they went into winter quarters, he slept in a tent until the men had huts built. And then he would move into a local house or something. He wanted his men to know that he was sharing their privations. I mean, he was warm and had good clothes to wear and good food to eat, but he was at least with them. And his army learned to love and respect him. And that was very important. He was not a great tactician. On the battlefield, he was often bested. He was commanding, of course, an army of ordinary men, of citizens in an age when armies were made up of professional soldiers. The Hessian soldiers, for example, that served in America. These were lifetime professional soldiers. Many of them, served for a generation. British Army not quite as professionalized as those German states were, but the British Army was well trained, well supplied, and had a tradition of success. And the Americans could never compete with the British in that way on the open battlefield, battle line, facing battle line. Washington tried to train them to do so, but he recognized that was a push. Tactically, the Americans lacked cavalry. We lacked much in the way of artillery until fairly late in the war. Our artillery was second grade, but we got to be very good by the end of the war, our artillery. It was a process of learning, and Washington managed to hold the army together while it learned to become, if not fully professionalized, semi-professional. But so those are the problems. What were Washington's benefit? He had the big strategic picture. He understood that Britain was trying to fight a war across an ocean. No European power, no European imperial power had ever sent a larger army across the sea than the one that the British sent to New York in 1776. Its purpose being to wipe the American forces out fast before France and Spain entered the war, not because they were sympathetic to the American Republican cause, which they certainly would not be.
Large, though, sounds like an advantage for the Brits. What was the disadvantage of sending them across the sea? So, if I understand the tone of your voice, you sound like, okay, this is a difficulty.
It was. The British sent an army of about 35,000 men across the ocean. And I understand that when the British evacuated Boston in March of 1776, the British Army left. There were essentially no British troops anywhere in the American colony. A couple of little outposts hadn't been taken yet, but essentially the America was free of British troops. Congress voted Washington a gold medal and thought they were members of Congress who thought the war is probably over. But Britain had other plans. The British ministry, put together this army. Now you understand the peacetime army in Britain in the 1760s and early 1770s topped out at around 35,000, 40,000 men. One of the silly things that people will say sometimes about the American Revolution is the Americans were fighting the greatest military force in the world in Britain. That's not true. The standing army in France, at the same time that the standing army in Britain was about 40,000, the standing army in France was 400,000. And of course, the French aristocracy was dedicated to war. In fact, its whole conception of itself was built on the idea of military leadership, whereas the English aristocracy was a cultured and political leadership. It wasn't necessarily a military leadership. And The difference, of course, was that if France had an army 10 times the size of Britain's, why didn't they conquer their traditional foe? Well, the British had a fantastic navy. The French navy was about the same size, but the British Navy was better served. It was the most effective navy in the world. It had won for Britain the French and Indian War. That is the Great War of Empire at Sea in the late 1750s and 60s. France had spent an enormous amount in the 1760s and into the early 1770s rebuilding its military, rebuilding its navy. They invested tremendous amounts of money to build the largest fleet in the world, bigger than Britain's, but simply not as well served. They had the most sophisticated ships, but the sailors weren't as good, the gunners weren't as good. The British ruled the sea, and because they could rule the English Channel, the French couldn't conquer Britain, even though they had an army 10 times the size. But to send an army of 35,000 across the Atlantic to put down the American Rebellion meant stripping most of Britain of its army. And of course, they couldn't send all of the standing army, so they left some in Britain and then hired German mercenaries to make up the difference. And that's why the mercenaries, not all from Hesse, but we call them Hessians, wind up in America. Highly professional soldiers. And Britain's military idea was to knock Washington's army out quickly. And they fight a campaign in the summer of 1776 into the fall of 1776 for possession of New York. And New York, not because it was this vast city. New York was very tiny. It just was the tip of Manhattan.
And just to understand something a little more clearly, you already gave one reason why they wanted to wipe out the American forces early, so that
they could
get it done before the French get involved.
Before the French get involved.
Is there a logistical concern too, like that just supplying an army of 35,000 men?
Sure. That's an enormous problem. They were able to use maritime, what we think of maritime Canada, Nova Scotia, sort of a staging area. Yeah. But at first, their attack New York. The British don't take command of a large agricultural hinterland, so they have to keep sending food and supplies to America until they can take farm country. And what happened in 1776 is Howe's army, the British army, takes New York relatively easily, some big battles, takes Fort Washington, which is up on the northern end of Manhattan, is the largest fort on the island, along with most of Washington's supplies, 3,000 men, all lost. Washington is driven back across New Jersey, which is a rich agricultural colony, and into Pennsylvania on the other side of the Delaware. And at that point, it looks like the war is coming to an end. Howe believes it is coming to an end. He thinks Washington's army will disintegrate with the coming of winter, and that he is, well, it took him a little longer, in weeks, a couple of months longer than he expected. The American rebellion is being put down. In fact, here's one of my favorite moments of the revolution. While the British Army were pursuing Washington across New Jersey, General Howe, William Howe, the commander of the British Army, had a meeting with Lord Cornwallis. Cornwallis was one of his lieutenants, and Cornwallis said, I can chase Washington down and defeat his army before they get across the Delaware River. Do I have permission to do that? Howe said, no, let him go. Let him cross the river. And Cornwallis was puzzled, and Howe said, this is coming to an end, and I will need someone to surrender to me. And that isn't as ludicrous as it sounds. I mean, we didn't bomb Tokyo at the end of World War II. I mean, we firebombed Tokyo, but we didn't drop atomic weapons on Tokyo. One of the reasons that we didn't was that if we killed the senior leadership of the Japanese government, who would surrender to us? I mean, this was a calculation. And Howe expected the war to end. And Washington got across the Delaware, and Pennsylvania responded in an extraordinary way. I mean, many soldiers, militia, came into Washington's camp. The army revived in many ways. There was an extraordinary amount of guerrilla action. Then Washington jumps across the Delaware River, attacks the Hessians at Trenton, captures the outpost there. And the British sort of dismissed this. House says, well, they were mercenaries. what were we to expect? We shouldn't have put mercenaries on the front line there. We should have had British troops. But when Washington comes up against our men, there will be a different story. And that set the stage for one of the great strategic moments of the war. Washington crossed the Delaware River again, faced off against Cornwallis at Trenton for a second time, and they didn't come to battle because the night was falling. And after night, Washington slipped away to the north, attacked at just after dawn the British outpost at Princeton, utterly defeated it. And it was a great battle.
What are the numbers?
A few thousand men on either side.
On either side, but it's comparable weight on either side?
Yeah, British outpost at Trenton, at Princeton, was smaller. It was commanded by Colonel Maud, who was one of these wonderful English Whig gentleman soldiers, who had dogs that followed him onto the battlefield. But for all that, a very fine soldier. He saw Washington's army marching toward Princeton, which was a British outpost. He didn't know what to do because he didn't believe Washington. What were the Americans doing there? They were down at Trenton, several miles away. But like British soldiers did during the great era of the British Empire, not knowing quite what to do, he decided the thing to do was to attack. And so he attacked Washington's army. He was outnumbered and faced off against Washington's army. It's January the 2nd, 1777. The leading elements of Washington's army were commanded by an old friend of Washington's, General Mercer, and they met one another in an orchard, just a little bit from Princeton University today, and exchanged fire. The Americans got the better of that. British fired over their heads. The British were coming uphill, and sometimes soldiers shooting uphill will do that. They wind up shooting above their enemy. The British took severe fire, but kept on coming through the orchard close enough to begin a bayonet charge. And here lies some of the human drama of the Revolutionary War. Mostly didn't have bayonets, particularly at this point in the war. Bayonets are attached to military weapons, and Americans had a kind of hodgepodge of civilian and military weapons, but they didn't have bayonets, not enough. And when the enemy is charging at you with bayonets, and you have none, of course, it takes over 30 seconds to reload one of these guns. So the gun has become useless. It is either a spear or it's at best a club. And you'll see this in some paintings. Somebody had turned their musket around and they're swinging it like a club because that's what you've got, what war has become. And just beyond, just on the orchard, they clashed. The Americans ran as they had run before. General Mercer was killed, bayoneted several times. The British soldiers who shot him thought that he was Washington, who was so well dressed. And so they thought they had killed Washington. But Washington, who was leading troops in sort of the second wave, if you will, behind, saw this. And he brought the units that he had near him. Most of them were what we call Pennsylvania Associators. Here an aside, Pennsylvania government had for generations been Quaker and therefore opposed to war, and they didn't have an official militia. And so the Pennsylvania Associators were voluntary militia. They made up their own companies outside of government authority. And there were Quakers among them. They were, of course, frowned upon by many of their fellow Quakers. But Washington organized the Associators in line of battle and led them forward personally, riding in front of them. And there were people who said they looked at this and just held their breath, thinking that Washington was going to be shot dead at any moment. And Washington's personal example, he recognized at that moment that if he were to sort of save this battle, he had to demonstrate the kind of personal courage, and his men had to see it. And of course, we don't think of war that way, the personal courage of a general. But everybody who watched him that day recognized that this was a man who simply had no fear of dying. And they attacked across that field, swept the British from the field at Princeton. It was the first great victory of Washington's career on the open field against the British Army. But it was a small battle. In the history of the British Empire, a skirmish. And yet, as a result, the British had to evacuate New Jersey, retreated to New York City. And so after 7-8 months of the most expensive, largest overseas operation any European empire had ever undertaken, all they had done was taken a small city and a good harbor for the Navy and nothing else. And the French were watching, looking for their opportunity to enter the war, which they would do in later that year, 1777, and enter the war actively in 1778. It became an international conflict. Washington understood this. To get back to your question, Washington understood the strategic importance. He understood the sort of Atlantic or even global nature of this war. That to win it, he needed naval power. He had none. America had no navy. Britain had over 100 ships, some of them carrying more than 100 guns. We cannot underestimate the importance of naval power in the generation of the American Revolution. At its peak, Washington's army had less than 40 cannons. A few more if you count the little ones. A first-class British man-of-war carried between 115 and 130 guns, much larger. In other words, one broadside of one large British warship had more firepower than Washington's army ever had. And the British had many ships of that size. And most Americans lived within 100 miles of salt water. They lived in and around port cities, Charleston, Philadelphia, New York, Boston, so forth. And the entrance of the French into the war, which Washington knew that he needed, was vital to his success. And he understood. And working with the French wasn't an easy thing. He distrusted French motives, naturally. It seemed that they wanted to recover Canada, which they had lost in the French and Indian War, that they would have territorial designs. They were certainly no friends to American republicanism. France was an absolute monarchy, wasn't a constitutional monarchy like Britain, and there were many Americans who were very and deeply distrustful of the French alliance. The idea of allying ourselves with this Catholic power was more than some of them could take. It was one of the reasons Benedict Arnold gave, the reasons Arnold gave for his treason, not to all be trusted, but one of them was why have we allied ourselves with the autocratic power of the Roman Catholic Church, the one great nation state which is, supports Catholic autocracy. There was a strong sense of sort of Protestant zeal in many Americans that made them deeply distrustful of France, and yet France was essential. Washington saw that.
I hope you enjoyed the discussion with Jack Warren. This is the first of our two-part episode on the American Revolution. Thanks for tuning in. Until next time, this is Andrew Zwerneman for History 250.